He describes himself as a social media dork who helps brands do interesting things on the internet, and his YouTube channel is titled Analyzing the Shit Out of Social Media. He has recently left his job as Reddit as head of brand strategy to finish his book, The Hidden Psychology of Social Networks, which is soon to be published. The hashtag for today's session will be, and I've just spoke to him, SMWHH dork, D-O-R-K, since he's a social media dork. Please welcome all the way from San Francisco, Joe Federer.
I was hoping getting introduced as a social media dork would get a couple laughs at first, but hopefully that'll come a little bit later. Very excited to be here with you all and to share some thinking from my first book, The Hidden Psychology of Social Networks. It comes out next year. The book is kind of a look at social media through the lenses of evolutionary biology, psychology, and anthropology. And it's meant to kind of deep dive into why we find social media so compelling and so interesting, how it's become so ubiquitous kind of in our culture, and then how we as marketers can kind of take cues from what value people derive from these spaces and fold that into our social media strategies. And if I'm being honest with myself, that sounds a little bit sneaky when I say it that way, but I promise that one of the things that I've loved about specializing in social media, and I've spent a lot of time on the agency side and on the platform side, talking to brands about how to behave in social media in ways that will grow sustainably over time, is that social media has kind of required brands to be transparent and straightforward in ways that previous media generations really have not. And it's more than just explaining a message in a way that's kind of transparent. It requires, social media kind of becomes this force that requires brands to be straightforward and transparent all the way through from what they say to how they act. And what I want to start with today is kind of a challenge that I faced when I joined Reddit in 2016. I joined to start a team called Brand Strategy at Reddit. Reddit being kind of a new channel for most marketers, we had our work cut out for us. And my team was partnered with our media partnerships team to help brands kind of understand not just what a media buy looked like on Reddit, but what it would look like to do something thoughtful that feels native, that adds value to the experience of users in that space. And one of the first steps towards helping brands kind of understand how to participate in Reddit is explaining what Reddit is, because Reddit is kind of a complicated social network, if you want to categorize it that way. Curious, how many people in the audience use Reddit regularly? I see like 5 people. Okay, cool. Then we'll start there. So when you land on Reddit for the first time, when you go to Reddit's front page, it can be kind of an overwhelming experience because what you're seeing on the front page is not just content from one community, but the top content from all of the communities that exist all the way through the 100,000 plus communities that exist on Reddit. So one of the ways that I explain Reddit to brands and to human beings who are interested in talking about Reddit with me is with this kind of visual. So Reddit is really, you can kind of consider as a network of individual communities that all kind of map together to form one broader community that kind of identifies itself as Reddit. And each community within Reddit has its own moderators, its own kind of content approach, like its own topic, and that's usually based on an idea or a passion, which is a really, really kind of different way of organizing people than most social networks do. And when you read about Reddit in pop culture, when you kind of visit the front page, there are a couple of stereotypes that kind of come to mind, and they're not untrue. Reddit has a massive kind of gaming representation, and I don't think that's an accident. I think gaming on Reddit works really well because gaming is not one of those interests that you're like really wanting to share across all of your social media channels. I'm a big gamer dork. I don't post about playing World of Warcraft on my Facebook page or my Twitter. But if I can go to a community of people who are interested in also dorking out about a video game, then I'm in good company, and I can have a deeper conversation about it than I would with kind of my average friends on other social media networks. Science is a massive representation on Reddit, and Reddit kind of makes news in the science world pretty frequently. In 2017, there was a really interesting kind of occurrence on Reddit. It happened just in a simple kind of comment thread under an article about like climate denial or some other infuriating thing like that. And someone in the comment thread, which is, if you are a Redditor, you find that half of the value of the platform is actually within the comment section. Somebody made this kind of note and just said, you know, we really should organize something like a March for Science that goes to Washington, D.C. and kind of makes our voices heard as a community that cares about science and kind of hearing what scientists have to say about our future in the world. And that comment became an actual March for Science movement, which now happens in dozens of cities all around the world. I think the date is on April 22nd, and this will be the third year running. So science and kind of this kind of deep curiosity about the world around us is a real hallmark of the Reddit community. And you can't talk about Reddit without talking about memes. These are some of my favorite communities on the internet. I did a whole series of talks about memes last year and the origin of the word meme in evolutionary biology. The word was initially coined to be analogous to a gene, where a gene is a unit of DNA. A meme was coined to mean a unit of idea. And you really need a structure like Reddit in order for things like memes to form. Most social networks organize us around kind of ourselves. We have our friend connections that we curate. We have a set of kind of subscriptions and pages that we follow. And nobody else in the world has a feed that's exactly like ours. And on Reddit, you're organized not around you as an individual, but you're organized around communities, which has real interesting benefits to forming things like memes, which, you know, it's not wrong to think about memes as kind of the internet's inside jokes. And in order to make an inside joke, you need common shared experiences. So this is kind of how I think pop culture kind of paints the Reddit community, but I want to go through a couple of communities that Reddit doesn't get a ton of credit for, but that get to some of the heart of what it means to participate in some of these smaller communities. Streetwear and fashion are huge representations on Reddit, and because Reddit is this kind of anonymous place, you find this really interesting kind of mashup of fashion photography with people kind of trying to preserve that anonymity. So you get these kind of really creative ways that people kind of mask themselves or allow their outfit to be shown, but without kind of revealing who they are. And it's a really interesting kind of phenomenon to watch because this isn't a fashion label determining what's cool right now. It's not a fashion magazine editor who's at the top of the hierarchy and saying, here's what the next season's going to look like. It's a very bottom-up fashion experience, which is kind of a new thing. It's something that communities like Reddit enable in a way that we really didn't see previously. Dechonkers is a personal favorite community of mine. If you're not familiar with the vernacular, a chonker is a chubby pet. And so a dechonker is when you take your pet through the weight loss journey, which I find like just absolutely hilarious, and like the internet loves chubby pets, like everybody knows that. But here's a little kind of counter movement that's ultra positive, and it's like, let's reward the pet owners who have like kept their pets healthy over time. Dechonkers, highly recommend subscribing to that one. And I have to talk about this community. I think this is, if I had to pick one community on Reddit that kind of got to the heart of why Reddit is so interesting and compelling, this is the one. And Change My View is exactly what it sounds like. This is a community of people who want to have nuanced conversations about really difficult, charged topics. So the way that Change My View works is that if I am interested in making a post, I will write a headline that describes a belief of mine. It could be anything from politics to religion to other communities on Reddit or the internet. It's really anything in the world that we have a particular belief in. And then we write a few paragraphs explaining why we believe that. And what we're doing by posting in this community is we're inviting people with different perspectives to come and share why they believe something differently. And this community uses the Greek symbol of a delta, the little triangle that they use in physics often to kind of represent changes, as kind of a badge. So if I write a post and I kind of make a case for why I believe something, and someone puts out a perspective that kind of makes me think about that problem differently, or makes me think about that issue differently, I would award that person a delta, and people in this community accumulate deltas as these kind of badges, as if to say, I've had nuanced conversations with people of different perspectives, and I've changed their mind. And I think that's the kind of power of social media that we don't hear talked about in pop culture. We don't hear the praise for these nuanced conversations that are happening on the internet every day. We just kind of hear about the kind of bullshit on Twitter between people who are just representing their beliefs and aren't really interested in engaging what they believe. So when I was starting the brand strategy team at Reddit, I had this huge range of 100,000 different communities on the platform. And I had to kind of come up with a way that we could talk about those Reddit communities to vastly different kinds of marketers who are interested in engaging totally different kinds of communities. And we had to find a way to kind of draw a thread through how can you be successful as a brand in streetwear and in dechonkers and in Change My View. And then I kind of stepped back from my technical difficulties. All right, we're back. So I stepped back from the problem that I'm facing, right? So I have this huge breadth of different kinds of communities that we need to kind of coach brands through. And I think that is a microcosm for what we are dealing with as marketers on the internet today. There are over 180 different active social networks around today, and maybe not all of them have 100,000 different communities that are participating in them. But each of those social networks has its trends and its cultures and its micro trends and its micro cultures and different kinds of values that people are deriving from their participation in those spaces. So what I tried to kind of look at is what are those kind of behaviors that we can exhibit as brands in this huge breadth of spaces? How can we navigate this huge set of territories that we can participate in and be thoughtful about that in a way that allows us to be scalable, but that also allows us to feel native to those different kind of psychological spaces. And having worked in social media for a long time, I see a lot of great behaviors in both of these kind of sides of the not Venn diagram yet. Brand behaviors that stand out and draw attention. So we see lots of like, as marketers, this is our bread and butter, right? We've got to find a way to kind of jump out and grab people's attention in these very competitive social feeds. And social media is really the most competitive environment that we as advertisers have ever had to kind of contend with. Sometimes those behaviors went too far. And I think, one of my favorite examples of this is like way back in the day when we used to try to write Facebook system copy that would like kind of gamify the algorithm, and you'd write like this post if you don't want your mom to die. And that was kind of our way of like, yeah, we're gonna get more likes that way. And we did, like that was an effective tactic at getting more engagement on a post, but it doesn't leave a great taste in the mouth of the people who are engaging with it, like who are trying to just kind of ward off the death of their mother by hoping that liking this post will do that. And then there are these behaviors on the opposite side that integrate naturally into the environment, and I think as advertisers and marketers in social media spaces, we should strive in some way to integrate into the kind of cultures that we're participating in. But sometimes we go a little bit too far in that direction too, and I think you see this in places where brands, and social media teams have gotten really good at this, of doing the social listening exercise and kind of finding ways that people are organically talking about their brand or the problem that the brand solves in social media. But sometimes we don't do the hard work of taking that problem, taking that insight, and filtering it through our kind of brand ethos and our brand purpose and our brand meaning, and putting it back out in a thoughtful way that's filtered through our perspective. Sometimes we just kind of regurgitate it back to people the way that they fed it to us. And as marketers, we need to drive more engagement than the average social media user. So I think that the kind of common thread here, the common territory, is that we need to find brand behaviors that add value. And I think that's one of those things that it's in the top of every listicle you've ever read about how to do social media marketing right. But it's really difficult for us to figure out what exactly is going to add value for people. It's not easy to figure out what it is that adds value on Facebook, that could also add value on Instagram, and that could also add value on Reddit. And I think here are a couple of examples of brands that I think have done this in really interesting and thoughtful ways and in a breadth of different kind of environments. Oh shoot, that was a video. Well, I'll describe the video to you. This was a TikTok campaign that Chipotle did last year around Halloween, where they started a little TikTok trend. If you've participated on the platform or you've watched some of the videos, you see that they kind of follow this formula of there's a consistent kind of background music, and then there's either some kind of coordinated dance or there's some sort of kind of unfold that happens that users and participants try to kind of put their personal twist on while staying true to the original trend. In this one, there's this kind of hilarious juxtaposition between this girl who's getting ready for Halloween, and she's kind of doing her makeup in this kind of sexy way, and she's looking all good, and then the music cuts, and she then suddenly kind of transforms into this like silly, crazy doctor. The music key changes, and this transformation happens, and then she takes a big bite of a burrito. And it was this really funny way for Chipotle to take organically what happens on TikTok and manifest their brand in it, give people a little bit of an opportunity to break out of the kind of glamorous, ultra-polished TikTok content that we usually see, and have a little bit of like lighthearted fun with it. Ziploc is a brand that I worked on in my last agency role, and I continue to come back to this work because I think it was such an interesting kind of breakthrough for us at the time. If you're familiar with Ziploc's marketing previously, what we often saw was the brand kind of take a very straightforward, logical approach to how they talk about their bags. Ziploc invented the Ziploc seal, so granted they believe that their seal is superior to all of their competitors, so there was a logical kind of thread there to, well, why don't we show the bag tests? And you've seen that spot before where it's like, there's two Ziploc bags, or there's one Ziploc bag in a competitor's not Ziploc bag, and the competitor bag kind of breaks open and spills stuff everywhere, and the Ziploc saves the day. That didn't translate super well into social media because there's just not a whole lot of different angles that you can take on that type of content. So we started to kind of take the conversation from why Ziploc is the best product to how you can best use Ziploc. And we created a series of like life hacks and recipes and fun DIY projects that involved the bags. And not only were we able to kind of trace that back to a huge improvement in in-store sales, so content within a social feed was able to drive sales at shelf, which is a unique kind of, it's very difficult for us to kind of do those studies without pretty expensive partnerships. But we also found that on top of a pretty substantial media buy, these posts earned 10% incremental reach on top of what we paid for. If you can see the teeny tiny screenshots there, some of these posts were driving hundreds of thousands of shares when they were posted, and that is a huge value as long as the value and the kind of strategy of the post is traceable back to the brand and sits within that kind of strategic brand framework. This is a campaign that we did on Reddit. There are plenty of like Reddit campaigns about like cool cars and like movies and video games and technology that I could have shown that were like, these are obvious fits for Reddit, but I thought Charles Schwab is a weird one, right? Like Charles Schwab is not who you expect to succeed on Reddit, but they had this insight that because Reddit is anonymous, because people value this kind of candid and deep conversation, there are a unique set of conversations happening only within page. I'm sorry, guys. Oh, there we go. So because there are these kind of unique sets of conversations happening within Reddit space, people get this kind of license to talk about their finances in a way that they never would in their other social networks. So on Reddit, you find that personal finance communities will discuss things from like, I've got all this student debt, how do I pay this off or consolidate it in a strategic way? Or I bought a car that I shouldn't have bought, and I've got to figure out how to like manage my finances better. Sometimes, and we see this like every couple of years, it cracks me up. We even get these posts that are like, I just won the lottery and I don't want to tell any of my friends on Facebook. Like, what should I do with this? How should I invest this money? So you get these kind of slices of people's financial lives that it may seem really counterintuitive that in an anonymous network among fellow anonymous users that you get these really candid insights into people's kind of financial situations. But it allowed Charles Schwab to have deep conversations about finance in that space with people who felt comfortable in the discussion. So Charles Schwab's kind of creative platform is Own Your Tomorrow. So we introduced the brand to the Reddit communities with a pretty straightforward prompt. We asked people to tell us what they were doing to own their tomorrow. And the responses that we got back were really interesting. We encouraged people to respond from all aspects of their lives. And we got answers all the way from, I'm doing yoga every day now, to I'm going to see a therapist, and that's something I should have done years ago, to I'm putting into my 401k finally. And I don't expect you to read this, but this was the top comment in the thread. And it was one of those comments where I was like, did the Charles Schwab marketing team come in here and like write this secretly as an anonymous user? That's not what happened, and I know that because I worked really closely with them. But this story comes from a person who says, I used to travel a bunch, and Charles Schwab was my bank, and one time I forgot to put a travel alert on my account, and I got frozen, and the Charles Schwab customer service team came to my rescue and saved the day. And I kid you not, this is written in here. It's like, the thing that I'm doing to own my tomorrow is I'm sticking with Charles Schwab. It's like, you guys had to have written that, right? But because there's a whole kind of transparent user history associated with any Reddit account, people checked this person out and saw that they're a normal user, they participate in lots of different kinds of communities. This story that this person wrote ended up at the very top of the thread and greeted every single user who clicked into the ad. And that's the kind of organic endorsement that when you are a brand that can be transparent and straightforward and add value to people's experiences, that type of stuff happens really naturally in the Reddit environment. So I've shown you, 2.5 campaigns that added value in very, very different ways. And I think the question that I continue to wrestle with is, how do we figure out what's going to add value to these very, very different types of communities? And I think that the unlikely person who has the insight that I was looking for is my friend here, Sigmund. Freud is one of these thinkers that his discoveries and his theories have become so common and ubiquitous in our culture that we're only left really with the kind of criticisms and the pieces of his theories that don't fit super well. Before Freud, we didn't really, as a general culture, believe in things like an unconscious mind and these forces within ourselves that we don't really have conscious control over. We didn't talk about things like our ego and these kind of different aspects of our psyches that aren't always above the kind of line of consciousness. And I acknowledge that there is some of Freud that just doesn't fit into a 2020 context. There are just parts of his theory that aren't super great to look at. So I did my best to kind of update him for more of like a modern kind of 2020 environment. This is about what I came up with. And then Freud has this really interesting quote, and I'll just let you guys read that for a sec. Just kidding. I wrote it here too. So technology brings us cheap enjoyments, the enjoyment obtained by putting a bare leg out from the bedclothes on a cold winter night and drawing it in again. If there had been no railway to conquer distances, my child would never have left his native town, and I should need no telephone to hear his voice. And I think that's a really interesting kind of insight. I think it's a little bit depressing, and it's a little bit too depressing to really characterize how we really interact with technology. But I do think there is something to this when it comes to social media, that social media, in a lot of ways, solves problems that social media creates. Like, how often do we get poked fun at for sitting around a dinner table with our friends and all of us kind of being plugged into our phones and being social through our device, but being antisocial to the people who are around us? And the part of Freud's theory that I think really sheds some light on what's happening in social media, I see this pattern of the id, ego, superego structure start to emerge within social media environments. And I want to go through just briefly kind of how Freud put this theory forth, and then I'll go into kind of how I see this kind of, again, reemerging within social media. So Freud tells us that we are all born into an id. We are an unfiltered self. We are our basic desires, our basic expressions, our basic creativity, with no kind of sense of a world that's out there or a social domain of people who are kind of watching us and judging us and who we have to kind of get along with in the future. As we interact in the world, as we express ourselves, we start to come to the realization that there is an outside world that's separate from us. And as we make that realization, our ego forms as this kind of crust on top of the id to say, okay, there is a real world out there. When I have desires that are rooted in my id, I have to find ways that are compatible with the reality out there to satisfy those desires. And then as we develop, starting with our parents and then into school and then throughout our lives, through tiny little social cues and our conversations with our friends, we start to learn these cultural rules. And the cultural rules then form what we call the superego. And the superego is home to two important forces. So firstly, we have an ideal self that we store in our superego, and then we have a conscience. And the conscience takes the gap between the ideal self, this kind of vision of who we would be if we did everything that we thought we were supposed to do based on our cultural rules, and it measures us against our ego. So it's our conscious center of action. So when we do something through our ego, through our kind of behavior, that doesn't align with our superego, our ideal sense of self, then we feel guilt. And so we're in this kind of constant push and pull between our basic expressions, our unfiltered self, the reality of the world around us, and this kind of ideal version of ourselves. This is a stat that it doesn't jump out at you as crazy, surprising, but I think it gets weirder the more that you think about it. So the average social media user has 8.5 different profiles across different social sites. This number continues to grow. So I think it was in like 2014, the average was 3.5 different social profiles on different websites, and it grows steadily every year. And when I look at the way that social media gets talked about in the news and in kind of popular media, often social media kind of is leveled against as this kind of shallow, oh, we're just kind of seeking attention, we're just wasting time. I think if social media was that simple, that this number would start to shrink, that we would start to consolidate our social profiles because it would be easy for us to kind of figure out, okay, well, here's where I'm getting the most kind of brainless entertainment. But because this continues to grow, I think what's happening here is that we are starting to kind of derive different types of psychological value from participating in different kinds of social networks. And I think that has a lot to do with the structure of the social networks themselves. So the way that I kind of see this mapping back to the id, ego, superego, when we engage in a platform like Facebook or Snapchat, we're in ego space. We have this keen sense that anything that we do in a platform like Facebook has a one-to-one correspondence with who we are offline. We curate our friends list, right? So we have this mutual kind of connections that we make with different people most of the time. So there's an agreement that we make. We have a curated, closed group of people with whom we're going to interact, and we're clearly identifiable as our offline selves, right? So I'm definitely Joe Federer on Facebook, unlike on Reddit where I'm Jareth, King of Goblins. It's a little Labyrinth reference out there for you guys. When we go to a platform like Instagram or Twitter, and I think TikTok fits within this kind of quadrant as well, or this section as well, we have a lot of the same friend connections that we do on Facebook, but there's a distinctly different way that we interact with people within the network. We have this ability to reach out to an entire world of users who we don't have a personal connection to. We use things like hashtags to connect our content to conversations and to people who we've never met before. And I think we put on a little bit more idealized version of ourselves in those spaces because we know that we're kind of discoverable. And I think it's interesting that in most superego ideal self networks, we use the language of following each other. We don't add friends, we follow. And it's a one-way kind of relationship. Hopefully, it's a two-way, and you follow somebody and they follow you, but that doesn't always happen. And so there's this kind of different type of relationship that we have with the people that we're connected to in those spaces. Then when you come down to platforms like Reddit, and there are a lot more platforms than just Reddit that would fall into this kind of group, but I think Reddit is the best example of a truly large-scale social network with a lot of structure to it. In this space, we get to be disconnected from our offline selves, and we're connected to people not around our personal connections or a curated feed that is particular to us. Rather, we are connected to people through our ideas and the types of content that we find interesting. We're organized around communities rather than being organized around kind of ourselves. So hopefully, it's kind of clear how the campaigns that I showed earlier on, except for the TikTok one, kind of map back to this structure, right? When I'm in a social network like Facebook and Snapchat, where I'm connected to the people that I know in my personal life, content that helps me spark conversations with those people is really useful. So if I'm a millennial mom, which is the kind of target audience for our Ziploc work, and I come across these cool life hacks or this cool new recipe for Halloween candy bark or whatever that thing is called, it's really valuable for me to not only share that because it's a cool idea, but it also kind of helps me define myself to my friends within that network, right? It's as if to say, look how cool and crafty I am. And when I share that post, which was made by Ziploc, when I click that share button, it's not Ziploc's post anymore, it's my post. And I get the credit. I get the social credit for when people engage with that in my feed. And there's something really valuable about that to us. In a space like TikTok, where people are kind of... Time's the charm. There we go. In a space like TikTok, where we have this potential to be discovered by people, where we can show ourselves off in kind of a glamorous way, but then also kind of show people a humorous side to us, that's a really nice way for us to allow people to co-create meaning with us as brands, right? If we put out something that's a trend, that trends within a TikTok space, that allows people to kind of infuse their own meaning into it, if we allow people to make the campaign with us, then there's a lot of value to the users who participate in it. They get some reach. They get some additional kind of viewership by participating in our challenge. And there's ideal self value to be derived there. And within Reddit, Charles Schwab is sparking just discussion. And that's something that is really valuable to the Reddit community. When you go to the Reddit community, you find that, like I said before, half of the value is within the comments section. And people love having these long, in-depth conversations in Reddit where they're learning things and they're able to kind of discover new perspectives. One of the ways that I frame the kind of prompt construction for brands is that we want to ask questions, unlike in most social media networks where we might say, if we're a music brand and we want to find out, we want to drive engagement within a post, and we want to say like, what's your favorite song? And it's like, we know that we're going to get a lot of responses on that, but it's like, who cares? On Reddit, we'd want to ask something that is as interesting for us to respond to as it is for us to read through other people's responses. So we want to give people a platform to discuss these ideas that are interesting to them, but that are also interesting to other people. So just a couple of key takeaways here before I jump off the stage. Hopefully the sound stays. One, when brands add value in digital space, they get the benefit of both standing out and of integrating naturally into that environment. And I think that's really what we all ought to aspire to do when we create engagement-based social media campaigns. Adding value is reliant on context. So the different social networks that we participate in, the different psychological contexts with which we're engaging, there are different types of value that we need to add in those different spaces. So by understanding the user mindsets within those spaces, we can better predict what types of engagement and what types of brand behaviors we can manifest that will actually add value in a meaningful way. Thank you so much. Again, The Hidden Psychology of Social Networks comes out in September. Very excited about it. I'll be around. Thank you very much.